A winter power outage hits Anchorage. The grid goes dark. Inside a modern home on the edge of town, the thermostat clicks off. The furnace, a forced air system running on natural gas, dies instantly. There's fuel in the line. The pilot light could ignite. But without electricity, the blower fan won't turn and the electronic igniter board won't spark. The house starts cooling immediately. 4 hours later, the indoor temperature drops to 50 degrees. 12 hours in, it hits freezing. By the 24-hour mark, the pipes burst. Water expands 9% when it freezes, and that expansion shatters copper and PEX tubing running through exterior walls. The house is now uninhabitable. Repairs will cost $50,000, and the family can't stay inside. 60 miles away, deep in the bush, another home loses power from the same storm. The solar battery bank dies after 3 sunless days. The lights go out. The resident lights an oil lamp, walks to the wood stove, and feeds another split of birch into the firebox. The cabin stays 70 degrees. Coffee boils on top of the stove. Life continues without interruption because the heating system doesn't depend on the grid. It depends on combustion, convection, and thermal mass, physics that operate whether or not the power is on. The difference isn't toughness or lifestyle preference, it's system design. One approach optimizes for convenience and collapses when infrastructure fails. The other optimizes for zero external dependencies and keeps operating when everything else stops. Modern heating systems hide their fragility behind ease of use. You set a thermostat to 68 degrees and forget the process. The furnace kicks on automatically. Warm air flows through ducts. The system regulates itself, but that automation creates vulnerability. A typical forced air furnace in an urban home relies on 3 continuous inputs: natural gas from a municipal pipeline, electricity from the grid, and functional circuit boards controlling ignition timing and airflow. Remove any one of these and the system stops working. The gas may be present, the ducts may be clear, but without electricity to power the blower fan and igniter, the furnace is inert metal in a basement. This is a single point of failure design. The entire heating infrastructure depends on uninterrupted electrical service. When that service cuts out, from a storm, equipment failure, or grid overload, the consequences cascade rapidly. Modern homes are insulated well enough to resist heat loss under normal conditions, but they don't store heat. Once the furnace stops generating warmth, the building cools at a rate determined by outdoor temperature and insulation quality. In interior Alaska, where winter temperatures regularly drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, this cooling happens fast. A well-insulated home might maintain livable temperature for 6 to 8 hours. After that, the interior approaches freezing. Water inside pipes freezes, expands, and generates enough pressure to split metal and plastic. The home becomes uninhabitable even after power returns. Off-grid cabins avoid this cascade entirely by using heating systems that operate independently of external infrastructure. The heat source doesn't require grid electricity, pressurized gas lines, or electronic controls. It runs on locally sourced fuel and physics. A wood stove requires 3 things to operate: oxygen, fuel, and ignition. All 3 are available locally. Oxygen comes from the air inside the cabin. Fuel comes from trees harvested within a few miles. Ignition comes from a match or a ferro rod. None of these inputs depend on infrastructure outside the property. This decoupling is the core difference between grid-tied and off-grid heating. When a solar battery bank dies or a generator runs out of fuel, the lights in an off-grid cabin go out. Communication devices stop working. Refrigeration fails. But the wood stove keeps burning because combustion is a chemical reaction, not an electrical process. The fire doesn't care whether the power is on. The system is physically separated from infrastructure collapse. A natural disaster that knocks out regional electricity doesn't affect the stove's ability to generate heat. A supply chain disruption that halts fuel deliveries doesn't matter if you've already stockpiled 6 cords of seasoned wood. A broken component in one part of the cabin, a failed inverter, a dead battery, doesn't propagate through the heating system because there's no shared dependency. This independence comes with trade-offs. Operating a wood stove requires manual labor. You split the wood, carry it inside, light the fire, and feed it throughout the day. You monitor the draft, adjust the air intake, and clean out ash. The system doesn't regulate itself. It requires constant human input, but that manual operation is also the source of its resilience. There are no circuit boards to corrode, no igniters to malfunction, no blower motors to seize. The failure points are mechanical and repairable: a cracked door gasket, a rusted flue pipe. These can be fixed with basic tools and replacement parts that don't require specialized electronics or factory service. The result is a heating system that works as long as you have fuel and the ability to light it. Everything else is secondary. Not all wood delivers the same amount of heat. Trees store solar energy in their biomass, but the density of that biomass determines how much energy you get per volume. This matters because heating a cabin through an Alaskan winter requires moving large amounts of fuel, felling trees, cutting them into rounds, splitting the rounds, hauling the splits, and stacking them near the cabin. The denser the wood, the less volume you have to process for the same heat output. Paper birch is the premium fuel in interior Alaska. A full cord, a stack measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, delivers 26.2 million BTUs when air-dried to 20% moisture. Birch burns hot, produces a long-lasting bed of coals, and is dense enough that you don't need to feed the stove constantly. It's the closest thing the boreal forest has to anthracite coal. White spruce, which grows more abundantly, delivers 19.1 million BTUs per cord. It's a useful fuel for getting a fire started quickly or generating flash heat during the shoulder seasons, but it burns faster than birch and doesn't produce the same coal bed for overnight heating. Spruce also tends to pop and spark due to resin pockets, which can be a hazard if the stove door is open. Cottonwood and aspen are the lowest quality fuels, delivering only 15 to 17 million BTUs per cord. They're easy to find and easy to cut, but the energy return doesn't justify the labor. To get the same heat output as 6 cords of birch, you'd need to harvest, split, and stack more than 8 cords of cottonwood. That's 35% more volume, 35% more trees to fell, more rounds to split, more trips hauling splits from the woodpile to the cabin. This difference compounds over months. If you're heating from October through April, choosing cottonwood over birch means an additional 2 to 3 cords of labor for the same thermal result. That labor has a caloric cost. Felling trees burns 600 calories per hour. Splitting wood by hand burns 450 to 500. Hauling and stacking adds more. Over a full season, the penalty for selecting low-density wood is paid in sweat and exhaustion. The harvest timeline matters as much as species selection. Felling happens ideally in winter when trees are dormant and sap content is low. Once a tree is down, it must be bucked into rounds and split immediately. The bark acts as a waterproof skin. Leaving it intact on a whole log prevents the interior from drying. Splitting exposes the grain to airflow, allowing moisture to escape from the wood cells. Verification is simple. A seasoned log makes a hollow clacking sound when struck against another piece. Green wood makes a dull thud. The difference is audible proof that the water has left the cellular structure and the wood is ready to burn efficiently. Off-grid residents treat wood selection as a logistical calculation, not a matter of convenience. The goal is to maximize BTUs per unit of human effort. Birch wins that calculation in most of interior Alaska. Freshly cut wood doesn't burn efficiently. Green wood can be 45 to 50% water by weight. When you burn it, a significant portion of the fire's energy goes toward boiling off that water instead of heating the room. Water must undergo a phase change from liquid to steam, consuming heat energy that would otherwise radiate into the cabin and venting it up the chimney instead. This inefficiency is measurable. Burning green wood at 30% moisture or higher reduces net heat output by up to 25% compared to seasoned wood at 20% moisture. You're feeding the same volume of fuel into the stove, but getting a quarter less usable heat. There's a second problem. As the moisture evaporates, it cools the combustion gases traveling up the flue. If those gases drop below 250 degrees Fahrenheit while still inside the chimney, the smoke condenses into creosote, a sticky tar-like residue that coats the inside of the pipe. Creosote is highly flammable. Thick deposits can ignite during a hot fire, causing a chimney fire that can spread to the roof structure. Seasoning wood eliminates both problems. The process works in two stages. First, the free water sitting in the cell cavities of the wood evaporates relatively quickly once the log is split and exposed to airflow. Second, the bound water trapped within the cell walls takes much longer to escape. This is why splitting logs immediately after felling is critical. The bark acts as a waterproof barrier, and leaving it intact on a whole log prevents the interior from drying. Birch typically requires 12 to 18 months to reach 20% moisture content when properly stacked and exposed to air circulation. Spruce dries faster, 6 to 12 months in most conditions. The wood is ready when it makes a hollow clacking sound when two pieces are struck together. Green wood makes a dull thud. This drying timeline forces off-grid residents to think a year ahead. The wood you burned this winter was cut last summer or the summer before that. There's no cheating the process. Physics dictates the schedule, and if you fall behind, you either burn wet wood inefficiently or run out of fuel. Older wood stoves waste fuel. When wood burns, it doesn't just produce heat and ash, it releases volatile gases. These gases are unburned hydrocarbons, essentially smoke that still contains energy. In a traditional stove, this smoke travels straight up the chimney and vents into the atmosphere. You're throwing away fuel. Modern off-grid stoves use secondary combustion to recapture that energy. The design adds a second stage to the burning process. At the bottom of the firebox, wood undergoes primary combustion. The logs catch fire, release heat, and produce smoke. That smoke rises toward the top of the firebox, where a series of perforated steel tubes are positioned just below the roof of the stove. These tubes have small holes drilled along their length. As the smoke passes by, the tubes inject jets of superheated oxygen into the rising gases. The oxygen comes from outside air pulled into the tubes by the draft. When this fresh oxygen mixes with the hot, fuel-rich smoke, the smoke itself ignites. This creates a secondary flame, sometimes called a ghost flame, that burns at approximately 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. It appears as a rolling wave of fire near the top of the firebox, separate from the flames on the logs below. This secondary burn consumes the volatile gases that would otherwise escape as smoke, extracting an additional 20 to 30% of heat from the same piece of wood. The effect is visible. When a secondary burn is active, the exhaust coming out of the chimney is nearly transparent. There's almost no smoke because the combustible gases have already been burned inside the stove. In an old stove without secondary combustion, thick gray smoke pours from the chimney, wasted fuel leaving the system. Secondary combustion also prevents creosote buildup. Because the smoke is burned at high temperature before it enters the flue, the gases stay hot enough that they don't condense into tar on the chimney walls. This reduces the risk of chimney fires and cuts down on maintenance. You're not just getting more heat, you're getting a cleaner, safer system. The design requires no electricity and no moving parts. It's purely geometric: the placement of the air tubes, the size of the holes, the shape of the firebox. Once the stove reaches operating temperature, the secondary burn happens automatically as long as there's enough draft pulling air through the system. That draft is driven by the stack effect. Hot air from the stove is less dense than cold air. As it rises up the chimney, it creates a vacuum, a zone of low pressure inside the firebox. Room air, which is cooler and denser, rushes in to fill that void. This pulls fresh oxygen into the fire and keeps combustion going. The stove doesn't push smoke out, the cabin air pushes it up by creating a pressure differential. This same principle drives circulation throughout the entire cabin. Hot air rises from the stove to the ceiling, spreads horizontally, cools as it contacts the walls, and sinks back toward the floor. The cooled air flows back to the stove, gets heated again, and rises. The cabin becomes a self-sustaining convection loop powered by density differences alone. This is why the floor in an off-grid cabin is always the coldest zone, often 15 to 20 degrees colder than head height. The air stratifies naturally. Heat doesn't distribute evenly on its own. It follows the physics of buoyancy and pressure. Log cabins are poor insulators by modern standards. An 8-inch softwood log wall has an R value of approximately 11. That's the measure of thermal resistance, how well the material prevents heat from passing through. A standard frame house with 2x6 studs and fiberglass bats achieves an R value of 21. On paper, the frame house should be twice as efficient at keeping heat inside. But thermal performance isn't just about resistance, it's also about storage. Fiberglass insulation prevents heat transfer but stores almost no energy. It's a barrier, not a battery. A log cabin wall, by contrast, contains roughly 10 tons of wood. Heating that mass to 70 degrees requires substantial energy input, but once heated, the mass releases that energy slowly over hours. If the fire goes out at midnight, the logs are still radiating warmth at 8 in the morning. The cabin temperature might drop from 70 degrees to 55, but it doesn't plunge to freezing. This thermal buffering is a survival feature. If you oversleep and the fire burns out, the stored heat in the walls buys time to wake up, rekindle the fire, and restore comfort. Stove material follows the same principle. Plate steel stoves heat up fast but cool down fast. They have low thermal inertia. Cast iron absorbs heat more slowly but releases it more gradually, smoothing out the temperature swings. Soapstone takes this even further. It absorbs heat twice as effectively as steel and holds it 3 times longer. A soapstone stove can stay warm to the touch 8 hours after the fire dies. The trade-off is startup time. A steel stove gives you instant heat. A cast iron or soapstone stove takes longer to warm the room initially because it's spending energy heating its own mass first. But once that mass is hot, it becomes a radiator that works even when you're not actively feeding the fire. Wood stoves are reliable, but they require constant attention. You have to split fuel, carry it inside, light the fire, and feed it throughout the day and night. If you're injured, sick, or simply exhausted, maintaining that fire becomes difficult. Off-grid cabins often include a backup heating system for these situations, something that can run unattended for hours or days. The common choice in urban Alaska is a monitor or Toyo heater. These are oil-fired units that use electronic controls, blower fans, and ignition circuits to burn heating oil efficiently. They're popular because they require minimal input. You fill the tank, set the thermostat, and the unit maintains temperature automatically. But these systems depend on electricity. The circuit boards, igniters, and fans all need power. In an off-grid cabin running on solar or a generator, this creates a dependency loop. If the battery bank dies or the generator fails, the heater shuts off even if there's fuel in the tank. You're back to the same vulnerability that grid-tied homes face. The alternative is a gravity-fed drip stove. These units have no moving parts and no electrical components. The design is mechanical. A fuel tank is mounted higher than the stove, usually on a wall bracket or an exterior stand. Gravity pulls the heating oil down through a copper or steel line into the stove. A manual carburetor, essentially a float valve, controls the drip rate. The oil drips into a burning pot where it ignites and produces heat. There are no circuit boards to corrode, no fans to seize, no igniters to fail. The system works as long as there's fuel in the tank and the burn pot has a flame. You can light it with a match. It doesn't need a battery or a generator. It's completely independent of electrical infrastructure. The trade-off is efficiency. Gravity-fed stoves are less efficient than electronically controlled heaters. They don't modulate fuel flow as precisely, and they don't distribute heat as evenly without a blower. But efficiency is secondary to reliability. The goal isn't to optimize fuel consumption, it's to ensure that heat continues when everything else stops working. This is the logic of redundancy in off-grid systems. The wood stove is the primary heat source because it's the most sustainable. You can harvest fuel indefinitely from the surrounding forest. The gravity-fed oil stove is the backup because it operates during periods when you can't physically maintain a wood fire. Together, they create a heating system with no single point of failure. Grid-tied heating turns residents into passengers. The thermostat abstracts the entire process. You don't think about combustion efficiency, fuel density, or airflow dynamics. Heat becomes invisible, something that just happens. This convenience works until the system fails. Most people don't know how to diagnose furnace problems or restore function manually. The heating infrastructure is a black box, and when it stops working, the only option is to call a technician or leave the house. Off-grid heating forces you into the role of operator. The woodpile represents exact BTU reserves because you cut, split, and stack every piece. Species selection matters because you've tested which burns hotter and longer. Draft dynamics are understood through adjusting air intake to control the burn rate. Weather monitoring becomes critical because wind direction affects chimney performance and temperature swings determine feeding frequency. This isn't theoretical knowledge, it's operational awareness built from daily system interaction. Comfort doesn't happen automatically, it results from active management. The cabin stays warm because someone keeps it warm through continuous engagement with fuel preparation, fire maintenance, and equipment monitoring. That engagement changes the relationship between comfort and infrastructure. Grid-tied homes depend on uninterrupted service from external providers, utility companies, fuel suppliers, repair technicians. Off-grid cabins depend on resident competence and preparation. The fuel is already on site, the tools are in the shed, the knowledge is in your hands. Failures are experienced differently as well. When urban power fails, residents wait for utility crews to restore service. The timeline is beyond their control. When off-grid solar batteries die, residents light oil lamps and feed wood stoves. The lights are out, but heat continues. There's no waiting for rescue. The backup system is already running. The psychological shift is from passive dependency to active management. One assumes infrastructure will always function and panics when it doesn't. The other assumes infrastructure will eventually fail and prepares accordingly. The preparation isn't paranoia, it's thermodynamics. Heat doesn't generate itself, it requires fuel, combustion, and containment. Understanding those requirements and controlling them directly separates freezing from surviving. Modern heating systems are optimized for a world where the grid never fails, fuel deliveries never stop, and repairs are always available. That optimization creates extraordinary convenience. It also creates extraordinary fragility. Remove one input and the entire system collapses. Off-grid heating systems are optimized for the opposite assumption, that infrastructure will fail, that supply chains will break, that you'll be alone when the temperature drops to -40. The systems are manual, labor-intensive, and require constant attention. But they work when nothing else does. The difference isn't about rejecting technology, it's about understanding that reliability and convenience don't always align. A forced air furnace is more comfortable to operate than a wood stove, but it's more vulnerable to disruption. A thermostat is easier to use than splitting birch and managing draft, but it doesn't teach you how heat actually works. The off-grid cabin isn't a rejection of modernity, it's a design philosophy that prioritizes function over abstraction. Heat is physics. Combustion requires oxygen, fuel, and ignition. Thermal mass stores energy. Convection moves warm air. These principles don't change whether the power is on or off. Building a heating system around them means building something that operates independently of everything else. In the bush, that independence isn't ideological, it's survival. When the nearest repair technician is 60 miles away and the roads are impassable, the heating system either works or it doesn't. There's no middle ground. The wood stove works because it's based on processes that don't require external support. It's not smart, it's not automated, but it's still warm when the lights go out.